Welcome to the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. The Grizzlies do have a second straight off day, but that doesn't mean there is not plenty to talk about. On Jaren Jackson Jr.'s legitimacy as an all-star reserve candidate, plus a lot of trade talk going on, how it impacts the Grizzlies, and looking at the Grizzlies matchup tomorrow night against the Orlando Magic. That and much more on this edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. Here we go. Or actually, now, here we go.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What an exciting afternoon it's been if you're an NBA fan, but if you're a Grizzlies fan, though the Grizzlies aren't involved in a lot of these rumors or trades that have happened today, there's still plenty to talk about. Shawn Coleman here with the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. I'm a credentialed media member with the Grizzlies, have been covering the Grizzlies for 4 seasons now. Over at Grizzly Bear Blues, I write about them, and here on Locked On Grizzlies, I talk about them. Find me at Stats SAC, Locked On Grizz. You can find the podcast wherever it's available: Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, the Odyssey app, free on all platforms and free right here on YouTube. Make sure you hit that subscribe button below. Lets us know you like the show. Lets others who like the show find it. Makes the overall experience as best it can be. So the 2022 NBA All-Star rosters have been announced. And of course, the big thing that we were all hoping for, we found out about last week, obviously, with Ja Morant being named an all-star starter in the Western Conference backcourt with Steph Curry. But the all-star reserves were announced when it came to the Western Conference. And the thing that stands out is this to me, is that 7 of the 12 reserves that were named came from 3 of the top 4 teams in the Western Conference. From the Warriors, you have Steph, you have Andrew Wiggins, and you have Draymond Green. From the Jazz, you have Rudy Gobert and you have Donovan Mitchell. And from the Suns, you have Chris Paul and you have Devin Booker. So the first team, the second team, and the third team in the West, fourth team in the West, who were in a constant battle to potentially keep that 4th spot, those 3 teams right now have at least 2 All-Stars in the 2022 Western Conference roster for the NBA All-Star Game. The first, second, and 4th team have at least 2 All-Stars. What about the 3rd team? That would be the Memphis Grizzlies, right? Last time I checked, yes, that's correct. A team that right now has a 4-game lead over the Utah Jazz in the Western Conference standings, yet the Utah Jazz have 2 All-Stars. Granted, the Grizzlies do have Ja Morant as a starter, and that's perfectly fine. But the point is that if the first, second, and 4th teams in the West have at least 2 All-Stars, why can't the 3rd team have a second All-Star? And that's what we're looking at when it comes to Jaren Jackson Jr. Of course, it was announced, and I want to take this back a bit, right? It certainly is nothing against the individual players. I'm more talking about the logic of things than I am the players. I think all 7 players that I mentioned should have at least some type. 6 of the 7 players definitely should have strong all-star consideration. Whether or not you think Andrew Wiggins should be an all-star, I don't think he should be an all-star starter. He possibly could be in the discussion to be an all-star reserve. But if Wiggins is a starter, and Draymond has made the team, that's perfectly fine. When Draymond's been on the court this year, he's played like an all-star. He's played like a defensive player of the year. But Draymond Green's going to be out for the All-Star game. He announced it when the All-Star reserves were announced earlier this week. And so if that is the case, you now have several players who could become potential replacements for Draymond Green. And in my opinion, the person with the strongest candidacy strongest resume is Jaren Jackson Jr. And there's multiple reasons as to why. Now, let's look at a few other players who legitimately could be in the conversation. DeJounte Murray, Anthony Edwards, Brandon Ingram, And because more of reputation and who they are or the team that they're on, and also the combination weighted average of fan plus media plus player vote, DeAndre Ayton and Anthony Davis. Those 5 players, those 6 players legitimately have a chance to be that replacement. But let's start to, filter out some things that kind of take away from the legitimacy of those 6 players' resumes. For Anthony Davis and DeAndre Ayton, have you played enough games? I don't necessarily think so. I think the level of play that you've seen from Jackson Jr., DeJounte Murray, Anthony Edwards, and Brandon Ingram, and the fact that they have played more games, though Ingram also has missed quite a few, DeJounte Murray has missed some as well. I think the overall play of those 4 players trump Anthony Davis and DeAndre Ayton's reputation. So in my opinion, it comes down to 4 players for that all-star position, especially if Commissioner Adam Silver does not go with a fan vote or some type of weighted vote. He certainly could. But when you break it down and when you start to consider some reasons as to why an Ingram or an Edwards or a DeJounte Murray or a Jackson Jr. deserve to be on the all-star team, every player has their unique reason why. Brandon Ingram may possibly be the most consistent, high-level offensive player of this group. Anthony Edwards is not far behind, and he's the most exciting offensive player of this group. DeJounte Murray probably is the most impactful overall player among this group, leading the league in steals, being the only other player besides Luka Doncic to have 18 points, 8 rebounds, and 8 assists per game. And then there's Jaren Jackson Jr., who, if you were to look at these 4 players and their impact on the offensive or defensive end of the court, out of those 4 players, Jaren Jackson Jr.'s defense stands out as the most elite impact among the offensive and defensive impacts of these 4 players. So each player that I mentioned, they have a legitimate claim. I personally don't think there's a wrong answer among these players to be an NBA All-Star reserve in the Western Conference. But here is the thing that stands out as to why it should be Jaren Jackson Jr. For one, it is the fact that his defense is, among these 4 players, he is at the highest level in terms of his defense than any of these 4 players are on either side of the court. His defense is more elite, in my opinion, than the offense of any of these 4 players or the defense of any of these 3 other players. That's what makes Jaren Jackson Jr., in my opinion, the most valid replacement for Draymond Green, because of the fact that among that group, his defense stands out as the most elite. And you see it now. We finally have gotten the impact of his defense. We finally see the respect is there with the fact that Jaren has come out of nowhere and now in many places has some of the best odds to be Defensive Player of the Year this year. Not just defensive first or second team, but Defensive Player of the Year. You don't see that type of recognition for these other players that I mentioned. Sure, DeJounte Murray in the most improved player race, that certainly stands out. Anthony Edwards as well. But we're talking about Defensive Player of the Year. And Jaren Jackson Jr. is emerging as being one of the clear favorites to win that award. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that I am an advocate for it being the individual success of players to be the number one factor in whether or not they're all-stars. And again, each of these 4 players that I mentioned, I truly feel individually should matter. They have every reason to be named an all-star replacement. None of these answers are wrong. But if you have these 4 players who, in my opinion, are very close in terms of what's going to be the tipping point to choose one or the other, if Jaren Jackson Jr.'s defense is the most elite side of the court where any of these 4 players make an impact, if it's Jaren Jackson Jr.'s defense that's the most impactful, that's also backed by he plays on the team that is significantly winning more than any of these other 3 players' teams so far this season. So if you're looking at individual statistics, I get the counting statistics for these other players, especially on offense, may stand out. But Jaren Jackson Jr.'s impact on defense, it's hard to see any of those 3 players offensively or defensively impacting it. And it also is absolutely in Jaren Jackson Jr.'s favor, that he contributes to winning and at a more frequent rate than those other players as well. But the other thing that stands out, in my opinion, is it goes back to the first point that I made. If the first, second, and fourth team in the Western Conference each have at least 2 All-Stars, if one of those players cannot play, stay consistent and make sure now that the first, second, third, and fourth team all have 2 All-Stars. That's the difference. That's what stands out. That is the right way of making things done. You've got the combination of what Jaren has done individually with the common sense of awarding winning when individual cases are so evenly matched. And I think that that's something that certainly could come to fruition from Jaren. I get that he probably hasn't had a full season of a resume as others have had. I get that he's entering the conversation because of his hot play over the last few weeks. But at the end of the day, he's playing at a level of potentially being a Defensive Player of the Year. Let's honor that and get him in the All-Star game. Honor the unicorn Jaren Jackson Jr. deserves to be a 2022 All-Star. What I will say this, regardless of what happens, what's more important to Jaren, what's more important to Ja, it's what's more important to the Grizzlies, is noticing what's going on around the trade deadline and how things that may not involve the Grizzlies may still impact their overall ability to make this season as special as possible. We'll discuss that in just a moment. But before we do, I want to talk with you a bit about BetOnline.net. And the reason why I want to talk with you about that is because it's a great opportunity for you to be able, when it comes to props, odds, lines, you have more than ever before. Football, we've got the Super Bowl. The big game is a week away, and it's the best sporting event that's out there. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just football. BetOnline has the up-to-minute info in pro and college sports, NHL, boxing, UFC, along with live, real-time updates of current games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the new offers available for the 2022 season. BetOnline, where the game starts. On Monday's edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast, I'm going to invite Richard Stayman, known as Mavs Draft's fellow Locked On Basketball Network host. He will be joining me to discuss all things NBA draft. I know it's trade deadline season, but I love to, around the 1st of February, really start to talk about some prospects and put some prospects in mind that Grizzlies fans could really start to concentrate on as we lead up into March during college basketball's peak season, but also around all the other different leagues now that players play in. We do have 3 picks. There's plenty of reason to discuss prospects, though we may not keep them all. It's still a fun topic to discuss. So Rich Stayman, a.k.a. Mavs Draft from Twitter, one of the best draft minds that's out there, will be joining me for our Monday podcast here on Locked On Grizzlies. So obviously it's been a crazy day around the NBA. A big trade that actually did occur, and then the rumor of another trade that potentially has a higher chance of occurring that could completely change the landscape of the Eastern Conference, yet it still potentially impacts the future of Grizzlies moves in a nutshell. Obviously, the deal that occurred was Norman Powell and Robert Covington from the Portland Trailblazers. Robert Covington and Norman Powell going to the Los Angeles Clippers for Eric Bledsoe, Keon Johnson, former Grizzly Justice Winslow, and a 2025 second-round pick. Now, obviously, make sure you check out Locked On Clippers, Locked On Trailblazers, Locked on NBA as your second listens of the day after Locked On Grizzlies for all the analysis from the team perspectives, the local experts on those moves. But here's the reason why this impacts the Grizzlies. When it comes to the Los Angeles Clippers, obviously, the thing that stands out is this is a move that is a bit of a surprise because we had heard rumors that the Clippers could kind of, mail it in this season, sell off some pieces, try to get better financially, and be in a position to maybe make a big move in the offseason to focus on next season. But instead, that significant move came now. And with getting Norman Powell, who could be a nice complementary piece to Kawhi Leonard and Paul George as they get healthier potentially next year, in adding Norman Powell, they also added Robert Covington. This seems to indicate that the Clippers are fully in on competing as much as possible and without a pick really to play for. Why not? Why not see what you could do this year? Especially if Paul George, or even if Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, while it's probably a low chance both will be back anywhere close to their normal selves this season, you don't really have any other reason, not to play to win. So why not play to win? Gain that experience for your younger players. And the Clippers did a great job of not only becoming more competitive to do that this year, but in Powell, they also gained a piece that could be a significant secondary piece to Kawhi and Paul George in future seasons. The reason why this impacts the Grizzlies is because now you're starting to see with the Grizzlies in the third spot in the West, and obviously the Jazz, and then the Mavericks, and then the Lakers, and then Denver, and the Lakers, and of course the Clippers. Each of those 5 teams that are behind the Grizzlies, they likely are going to have significant positive additions to the current status of their teams by the playoffs. For the Jazz, it's getting Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert back healthy. Whatever impact you feel that has, that's fine, but they're certainly better with those 2 players healthy than not. For the Mavericks, it becomes interesting to see what they may do at the trade deadline. Could this Portland fire sale lead to Dallas maybe going after Joseph Nurkic or CJ McCollum? We could honestly see that occur. So for the Dallas, it's a potential trade that occurs. And then, of course, for Denver, it's them getting back whatever forms they can get from Michael Porter Jr. and Jamal Murray by playoff time. And then for the Lakers, it's getting a healthy Anthony Davis and LeBron James into a groove. While with the Clippers, you're looking at them now strengthening their current team with the hope that maybe they'll get Paul George or Kawhi Leonard back by the playoffs. So the reason why this is significant is because the Grizzlies are going to be playing one of these 5 teams in the first round of the playoffs. And each of these 5 teams, naturally, due to either a big need to make a trade or returning players from injury, each of these 5 teams have a logical way in which they could even significantly improve from where they are now to where they are in the playoffs. So it's certainly something to watch. Listen, the Grizzlies themselves, they're not going to be scoreboard watching this early. Ja Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., Desmond Bane, everybody's all talked about it. They're not going to be scoreboard watching early. They're going to continue to try to win games as much as possible, and the rest will take care of itself. But the thing that stands out in this trade deadline is to make sure to watch these teams. Watch the Jazz, watch the Lakers, the Clippers, the Mavericks, and the Nuggets. The Nuggets have already made a smaller move getting Bryn Forbes. But beyond a lot of these teams getting healthy, which is going to make them harder opponents to face in the playoffs, we could potentially see another move or 2 that strengthens them as well. And then, of course, we want to talk about another trade rumor that's out there that may not necessarily come to pass, but it's interesting, the domino effect that could happen if a James Harden, Ben Simmons trade happens between Brooklyn and Philly. To me, the fallout from that impacts the Grizzlies is that now you have a scenario, you have an avenue that the Grizzlies could have potentially taken to add a really big significant piece over the summer. If Ben Simmons were to be traded to Brooklyn and James Harden comes to Philly, that takes away the Ben Simmons scenario as being a big all-in type move for the Grizzlies to go after. We've talked about Bradley Beal. We've talked about Jaylen Brown. We've talked about Ben Simmons. We've talked about the fact that Boston and Philly could go after Beal, and that means that instead of Brown or Simmons going to Washington, maybe they could instead get rerouted to Memphis in a bigger deal. Those were all really fun, big-time topics to talk about for the offseason. But now if Ben Simmons is traded to Brooklyn and Harden to Philly, both those teams are going to be satisfied. So an outlet to a potential move happening where it could involve the Grizzlies comes off the table. So that's the important thing to remember. Even if a deal doesn't get done by the Grizzlies, it's important to remember that things that happen now certainly can impact things that will happen in the few months and even in the offseason for Memphis. Beyond discussions now that could lead to potential deals later, you've got other teams. You could have a deeper potential, lineup of opponents that the Grizzlies are going to be facing to make it harder to come out of this first round this year. And also trades that occur right now, it could potentially take away logical avenues the Grizzlies could take to add a significant piece of their own over the summer. At the end of the day, this isn't that big of a deal right now. But in a league where one move leads to another move, you have such a big domino effect, especially if a significant trade occurs that not many expected to, that makes the plans of many change. One trade could certainly change the outlooks for several teams around the league. And that could be the case if James Harden and Ben Simmons are traded between the Nets and the 76ers. So again, not much going on when it comes to the Grizzlies directly. Not much going on the trade front right now when it comes to rumors and when it comes to potential moves for the Grizzlies to have. But it's very important to continue to make sure to monitor each and every move that's made, because in a league where one move can impact the intention of other moves for so many teams, for a team like the Grizzlies, who clearly are coming up on the time frame, coming up on their part in the competitive timeline, where they need to make significant moves to truly open that contention window, any big move that happens at the trade deadline this year could impact their potential to make a move in the offseason or the near future. But of course, we can talk about trades all we need to. The big thing for the Grizzlies, though, is to continue to win ball games. And they have a very good chance to do that against one of the NBA's worst teams in the Orlando Magic. But we saw this same scenario face the Grizzlies last year late in the season, as Memphis was coming off a very good stretch of play and were starting to refine their groove after struggling, and yet they dropped the game on the road to the Orlando Magic. How can the Grizzlies avoid that this year, unlike last year? We'll discuss in just a moment. But before we do that, listen, when we talk about NBA trades, what teams love to have is options. They love to have as many options as possible, as many routes as they can take. If one route doesn't make sense, they have another that they can pick up and make sense. Well, one thing I can tell you is this, is that if you love options, Built Bar is the place for you. Over 18 different options to choose from. Have it in the morning for breakfast, have it in the afternoon as a snack. But if you go to BuiltBar.com right now and you put in the promo code LOCKED15, again, Built.com, and put in the promo code LOCKED15, you'll get 15% off your next order of Built Bar. Go to Built.com, put in the promo code LOCKED15, and get 15% off your next order from Built Bar. Can't thank you enough for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen of the day, but don't forget to check out the Locked On NBA podcast this week, especially. Any All-Star news that comes out, Locked On NBA will be the first to cover it. Of course, any trade news that goes on, Locked On NBA and other Locked On NBA shows with local experts will be one of the best places for you to go to break it all down. And of course, don't forget our special February 10th, 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, NBA trade deadline show with John Corrales as well as Josh Lloyd, breaking down all the potential moves that could occur. Check out all the great action with making Locked On NBA, the Locked On NBA show, your second listen of the day after Locked On Grizzlies. So, of course, the Grizzlies went in last year to Orlando. I believe that they either played Orlando back-to-back, with one game being Orlando, one game being in Memphis. I can't remember off the top of my head. But the Grizzlies in April had played exceptional offensive basketball. They'd put together the stretch that they needed to really earn themselves a legit chance at the playoffs. And then coming to May, the schedule was supposed to be a bit lighter, was supposed to be a bit easier, but the Grizzlies fell a few times to the Pistons and other teams. They lost a few games that they should not have lost. So they go to Orlando, and it looks like Memphis is going to be able to get the victory, but Orlando just keeps hanging around. And the end result, Cole Anthony hits a big shot at the end of the game, and that really was a signature moment that helped him in last season on a good note and has allowed for him to absolutely have a wonderful season in his role for Orlando this year. But the Grizzlies, of course, are a much different team now, in a much better position now than they were then. But it still remains the same. Even if on paper this should be one of the Grizzlies' easier wins of the year, it's going to be hard to do that unless they continue to play their style of basketball and get the job done. And one wrinkle effect that could come into that is that when the injury report was released, it was announced that Ja Morant is questionable for tomorrow night's game due to foot soreness. Now, a couple of things could play into this. Obviously, there likely is a legitimate, some type of small injury that's going on. I would likely find it not anything to be concerned with. I would likely find it not anything that's long-term or anything like that. This could just be the designation. The rest, I know, obviously is out there as well. This could just be an opportunity for the Grizzlies to get limited minutes or potentially rest Ja, because we know how much he's been playing, how much he's been utilized with several of the Grizzlies' best shooters out in late January. But there's a good chance that Ja can be limited in some capacity tomorrow night. And if that's the case, that means the rest of the team has to step up, and they're more than capable of doing just that. What stands out about Orlando is that they are 29th in the NBA in offensive rating over the past 15 games, but they're also 10th in defensive rating. So this Orlando team plays very good defense at times, but obviously they struggle offensively. And the other thing that stands out is that Orlando and Memphis are 2 of the 5 worst three-point shooting teams since Christmas. So a big thing that's going to have to be in the Grizzlies' favor, what's going to be needed in tomorrow afternoon's game, don't forget the game is at 4 o'clock. What's going to be needed for tomorrow afternoon's game is the Grizzlies are going to need to find the success that they had against the New York Knicks and be able to hit their threes. They were 16 of 39, and that same mentality, that same strategy, that what the Grizzlies did to win that game against New York back on Wednesday night, they're going to have to follow that same philosophy. If Ja is limited, if Bane were to potentially be limited as well, it's going to have to take the whole team shooting threes. Because if the Grizzlies can find their stroke from 3, and if they can defend the 3 as well, the Grizzlies should naturally then be able to find their success winning in the normal ways that they do. Offensive rebounds, turning defense into offense, and getting out on the run. It's going to be a bit tougher because you're going to get over 40 minutes in this game of Wendell Carter Jr. and Mo Bamba being able to be in the paint to block the rim. And they're both formidable defenders. They're not great. They're not Jaren Jackson Jr., but they're lengthy. They have good size. They are good rim protectors. The Magic are a lot better defending in the paint or inside the arc than they are from 3. So the Grizzlies are going to need to do what they can to get a good start shooting from 3. Another DeAnthony Melton type effort where he comes in and adds an instant spark shooting, or maybe Zaire could get going from the corners potentially. Tyus Jones, maybe he has a good scoring game in his arsenal once again. Whoever it is, maybe it's everybody. That'd be great. Whoever it is, the Grizzlies need some type of early surge shooting the 3 tomorrow so that they can let their defense then set the tone and they can gain a lead that they can easily maintain. That's what's going to stand out. On the defensive end, the key is simply not letting Cole Anthony beat you. Yes, certainly the Magic could have another player, especially off their bench. They could have another player or two who could step up and potentially make the game a very difficult process. But if you can limit Cole Anthony, you're going to put a bigger scoring burden on players who aren't necessarily that, accustomed to having a big scoring burden to get the job done. Obviously, Franz Wagner, Jalen Suggs, since he's returned from his injury, Terrence Ross can light it up any night of the week. The combination down low when they're playing center of Wendell Carter and Mo Bamba, they could certainly be significant assets as well. But the Grizzlies simply need to play their style of game. They need to find their stroke from 3, and they need to put it on other players besides Cole Anthony to beat them tomorrow night. If the Grizzlies can accomplish those goals, I'm confident that they will be able to get a much-needed victory. It'll certainly be a lot of fun to see. Hopefully, Ja Morant will trend towards playing. Even if he doesn't, though, even if he does play, I would think that there may be a bit more monitoring as far as his minutes go and his overall usage, just to start with this easy kind of stretch coming up for the Grizzlies before a more manageable type of stretch than January coming up for the Grizzlies before the All-Star break, with the fact that Ja is going to play in the All-Star game, getting him a bit of rest leading up to that, and then obviously the elongated rest after the All-Star game, combining those two really could allow for Ja to stay as fresh as he can for the final stretch of the season. But this has been awesome. It's been a lot to talk about. Jaren Jackson Jr. absolutely deserves to be an All-Star. I'd love for them to make a fan vote, and I'd love for them to give us a few choices and Jaren be one of them, and see all the support and love that he would get beyond what he already knows is out there for him. But certainly it's going to be fun to see. Hopefully Jaren gets a deserved nod for the All-Star game, and we'll certainly keep you up to date with any more breaking news when it comes to the Grizzlies. Thanks so much. Hope you have a great day. Go Grizz. Enjoy the game tomorrow. We'll see you again on Monday here on the Locked On